In TF2, your crosshair needs to actually be on your target in order for it to count as a hit. So this shot shouldn't count as a hit, right? Why did that work? In TF2, whether your shot counts as a hit or a miss is determined through one of two ways. For weapons that fire bullets, the game checks to see if your bullet has hit a player hitbox, a set of boxes that conform to the player model. For explosives, the bounding box is used instead. The bounding box is also known as the collision hull, which handles things like you colliding with the map or other players. If your explosion intersects with the bounding box, a hit is registered. The Huntsman arrow uses both of these methods. If your arrow hits a player hitbox, it counts as a hit, and if that hit was on the head hitbox, it applies extra damage. But this is where it gets a little questionable. If your arrow misses the player hitboxes, it can still count as a hit. If your arrow connects anywhere with the bounding box, this big orange box around the player, it counts as a hit. When your arrow only hits the bounding box and not any of the player hitboxes, the game takes the point at which you've hit the bounding box, steps forward 16 units, looks for the closest player hitbox, teleports the arrow there, and applies the appropriate damage. So if the closest player hitbox on the point you've hit the bounding box is the feet, then your arrow teleports there and counts as a hit there. If the closest player hitbox is the head, then it's a headshot. The problem with this is that the bounding box is the same size for every class. This means that for the scout, who barely takes up his bounding box, effectively has a massive head hitbox for the huntsman. An arrow that hits any of the space above the scout's head will snap to the nearest player hitbox, which will be the head, giving you a headshot. Here is a visualization of where you can hit the bounding box to get a headshot. Besides directly hitting the player's head hitbox, if your arrow connects with any of the red highlights, it's also a headshot. The scout's entire upper body is a head hitbox. This looks really bad, but there's a small consolation. As I said, when your arrow hits the bounding box, the game steps forward 16 units from where your arrow hit before evaluating what's the closest hitbox. So if we shot the scout from the front like this, it wouldn't be a headshot. But if we hit the bounding box such that 16 units later it's in a highlighted area. Conversely, the heavy has almost no extra space in his bounding box, so he has a much smaller effective headshot hitbox than the scout. Here are the other classes' effective head hitboxes. There are some very interesting headshot angles. Since the hit detection looks for what's the nearest player hitbox, any changes in player animation changes your effective hitbox. I can't show you every single animation for every class because there's just way too many to record. But as an example, looking up generally reduces the area that counts as a headshot, and looking down usually makes it worse. And bounding boxes don't rotate with the player, they're aligned with the map. So you could end up fighting someone at a 45-degree-ish angle to their bounding box, making landing a hit on them even more generous.
They aren't sort of explicit. We think that this makes sense. We don't say, oh, and we think that this makes sense going forward.